Welcome to the 2020 New Testament Challenge. Today we're in Acts chapter 18, and Paul is in the city of Corinth. There in the city, he meets a husband and a wife, Aquila and his wife Priscilla. Now they are tent makers, and Paul is a tent maker by trade as well, so they stay together. In verse 4, we read that every Sabbath, Paul went into the synagogue and he reasoned with the Jews that were there and the Greeks that were God-fearers. At one point, though, in verse 6, the Jews opposed Paul. And so in protest, Paul shook out his clothes as a testimony against them. And he said, "May your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And so, verse 7, Paul left the synagogue and went next door to a God worshiper. I'm sure Paul was thinking, my ministry here is done. It's time to leave. But then, one night in verse 9, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and said, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and I am going to keep you from being attacked, and no one will harm you, because I have many people in this city." Verse 11, so Paul stayed for a year and a half teaching the people. Paul was having ministry there, even though there was opposition all around him. And he stayed for a year and a half because he was directed by the Lord. Then, in verse 18, Paul left Corinth and he went to Ephesus. He only stayed there a short time, but in verse 20, when they had asked him to spend a little more time with them, Paul declined. But before he left, he promised, "I will come back if it is the Lord's will." That is such an important phrase because we do not know what the future is. We don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen next week. The Lord is the only one that knows our future. So therefore, we need to submit to his sovereign will and his authority over every area of our life. In fact, James talks about this in chapter 4. James says in verse 13, "Now listen, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money.' Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a short time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, 'If it is the Lord's will, we will live or do this or that.' As it is, you boast and brag. Boasting is evil." Here, James is saying, we don't know what the future is going to be, so we too should say, if it is only the Lord's will, I will do this or that. There's a story that I had heard many years ago. It was a pastor, and he was there on his front porch. And there was a man on a motorcycle that stopped in front of his house and got off of his motorcycle and was tightening things up. The pastor really liked motorcycles, and so he left his porch, went down to talk to the man. And he said, "So where are you headed?" "Oh, I'm going to go into town. I'm going to sell this motorcycle." Well, the pastor said, "Well, that's a good thing, but what you really should say is, if it's the Lord's will." The man on the motorcycle looked at the pastor and he said, "God has nothing to do with what I do. I can do whatever I want to do." He got back on his motorcycle and went down the road. As that motorcycle went down the road, he came to a bend in the road. There were a lot of rocks on the road, and his motorcycle skidded out from underneath him. The man, his clothes were all torn. He had scrapes all about him, and he thought, now what am I going to do? I can't even get my motorcycle to town. He saw a house off in the distance, and so he started walking towards the house. When he got up to the house, he went and he knocked on the door, and this woman came out on her porch and she had a shotgun, and she was scared of that man because of how he looked, and she told him to get off of her property. And so he started running. Well, she shot in the air and he ran as fast as he could. He ran through a field full of briars and they were ripping and tearing his skin. And all of a sudden a storm came up, and he went under a tree to protect himself from the storm, and a bolt of lightning came and hit the tree and it knocked him out. Well, after a while, he came to and he started walking down the road. That pastor saw that man walking down the road and he recognized it was the same man that he had talked to earlier. The pastor went out and met him in the road. And he said, "Whatever happened to you?" Well, the man told him the whole sad story. The pastor said, "I've never heard of anything like that before my entire life. What are you going to do now?" And the man said, "Well, I guess I'm just going to go on home if it's the Lord's will." Again, none of us know what the future is, so we need to allow God to be God of every area of our life. So we too should always say, we will do this or that if it's the Lord's will. Thank you for joining the 2020 New Testament Challenge.